This presentation today is for Assessment 2. It's called Treaties in Australia, the Victorian Story, and focuses on the recent developments in that state. Firstly, I'll overview treaties up to present day within Australia, including Victoria. In 2018, Victoria became the first state in Australia with the introduction and passing of a treaty bill in the state parliament to progress towards reaching a treaty between the state government and the First Nations people. This acknowledges the existence of First Nations people within Australia, including Victoria, for over 60,000 years, and also the fact that they never ceded their lands and seas following the invasion and subsequent colonisation of Australia. Despite the concept of terra nullius being acknowledged as inherently false, the decision not to have a treaty with First Nation people in Australia, on which this was based, remains unresolved. The landmark Mabo versus Queensland decision in 1992 avoided challenging the underlying issue of Indigenous sovereignty rights, continuing the situation of a recognisably unjust denial of Indigenous people's sovereignty as the skeletal principle of the doctrine being challenged. While it provided legal recognition and entitlements through the subsequent Native Title Act in 1992 that some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have rights to their land, this was subject to strict criteria. So even when criteria was met, in some aspects, decisions were and are still subject to other people's rights of their land, which generally took precedence, according to Reconciliations Australia's article, which describes the impacts of the 3rd June Mabo decision. More recently, there have been calls to once again listen to First Nation people in Australia, based on the Uluru Statement from the Heart that was released in 2017. Following the National Constitutional Convention, which called out for a resolution that can address the torment of our powerlessness that has resulted from the dispossession of First Nations people from our lands. While it doesn't specifically ask for a treaty in the statement, it does seek major constitutional change and structural reform, based on the fact that they were the first sovereign nations of Australia. They also requested a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations, which could be seen as an alternative term or form of treaties, but avoids the politics associated with this term. Victoria is now in a position to provide an important example of how other states and the nation can achieve this treaty with its First Nations people. Acknowledging the ongoing consequences of colonisation for Aboriginal people and the need to provide practical rights and compensation through this process is an important outcome of a treaty in Victoria. So what has happened in Victoria with the treaty process, and what does this mean for Victorians and Australians in general? Jim Gallagher, who is the current Victorian Treaty Advancement Commissioner, highlighted the importance of a treaty for Indigenous people in a speech last year, describing the benefits that result when a treaty is achieved. These include recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty, reclaiming the inherent right to self-determination and culture, acknowledging the impacts of colonisation through truth-telling, and also the economic benefits as wealth is able to be created for and by Aboriginal people more effectively. The current treaty process in Victoria has been established by the state government with an aim to succeed. This contrasts to some early attempts at Aboriginal self-management and control of their affairs and businesses in Australia over time, which were often led by colonial powers and Western viewpoints. Instead of enabling people to truly take control of their decision-making and processes, it often set up the Aboriginal people involved to fail. This included a lack of acknowledgement of the inherent differences between how Indigenous and non-Indigenous approaches and expectations around managing their own affairs differ. Solomon describes the important role that Aboriginal community-controlled not-for-profit sector plays, particularly in remote areas, but it still is under considerable pressure from the need to be accountable and a lack of ongoing secure funding in many instances. The need to understand the role this sector plays in Aboriginal political identity, along with their material security, is seen by Sullivan as essential, but often overlooked. For the first time, Aboriginal people in Victoria have the legal backing from a bill that was passed through Parliament last year. It supports them to work towards a treaty in that state. The state government has also provided essential financial support that allows the participants in this process to realistically achieve at least the initial aims of the bill at the next stage. Any journey towards this treaty must come with adequate funds, which is acknowledged within the bill as an essential component of enabling the process to be successful, and was subsequently supported by the Victorian Government in the budget this year. It is important to look back and explore why Victoria is currently the first state in Australia to have progressed this far towards a treaty. Why has it been necessary? There have been ongoing attempts in Australia to work towards achieving a treaty for many decades. However, any early expectations of a treaty or agreements between First Nations people by the British Crown were overlooked by colonial powers at the time of invasion, as the rights related to Aboriginal sovereignty and subsequent need for a treaty were ignored. Mansell quoted Bonner's impassioned plea in 1988 when he stated, "You did not ask my people if you could come here or if you could occupy our land." No agreement was ever reached then, and while there has been acknowledgement of prior occupation by First Nations people, as mentioned earlier by the Mabo decisions, there has still significant challenges existing in their fight to achieve recognition of sovereignty as well as a treaty with Aboriginal people. It's important to understand what a treaty means in the Australian context and how it is currently defined as part of the process of reaching a formal treaty here. There needs to be a recognition of how it's different from other agreements that already exist between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people governments in Australia. Hobbs and Williams outlined the three conditions that they agree need to be satisfied that makes a treaty distinctly different from other agreements. And these conditions are generally agreed on by other legal scholars in Australia. These include recognition that Indigenous peoples are a polity and are distinctive from other citizens of a state based on their status as a prior self-governing community or communities. A treaty should be reached through a process of fair negotiation, conducted in good faith and respectful of each participant's standing as a polity or separate political identity. A treaty recognises or establishes concrete outcomes, inclusive of some forms of decision making and control, which amounts to some form, even if limited, of self-government. Hobbes also emphasises that treaties inherently concern relationships between peoples, quote, and can tell a story, quote, about the interactions between different normative communities that share the land and the values and responsibilities that secure the bonds of association between and among these communities. This distinction is important as it addresses concerns expressed by some Australians that a treaty would divide rather than unite a nation, and acknowledges that there will always be an interaction between all parties. Some of the significant events in Australia that relate to Indigenous rights, sovereignty and treaty from the 1960s until present day events are summarised on this slide. In 1967, there is a referendum passed giving Indigenous Australians equal citizenship rights in Australia for the first time. And after this, there were many subsequent events, including the establishment of the National Aboriginal Conferences. Independent Aboriginal Treaty Committee was established in the 1970s. The Barunga Statement was handed over to the Prime Minister, going blank. In 1993, as mentioned earlier, the Native Title Act was passed. There has been a recognition bill passed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in 2012. And then in 2017, Uluru Statement from the Heart. also many other significant events that aren't mentioned here, but if you do further reading, or if you may be aware of it already, it's been an ongoing process, but particularly from the 1960s onwards, many different groups of people have fought for land rights, for instance, have done petitions at Parliament, have advocated for change. Governments have shown that they have listened at times and have started a process of treaty making, for instance, but this has often been stopped by changes within the political landscape. What can we learn from other countries similar to Australia and their treaties? Why some people argue that a treaty in Australia could divide the nation into two nations, and people often create fear and uncertainty in the mind of others who hear this. How likely is this to result? We need to look at the impacts of other treaties, particularly those within similar nations like Canada and New Zealand, and assess what has occurred there as a result of treaties between their Indigenous people and governments. What is the Canadian experience? The historic treaties there were originally reached dating back to the early 1600s and are now joined by what they call modern versions of treaties. This is a process that began in 1973 and continues today. There are also amendments made to the Canadian Constitution in 1982, recognising and affirming the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of the First Nations people. British Columbia started working towards an alternative treaty process in 1992. This differed to the comprehensive claim system that previously was utilised. The current process in British Columbia intends to strengthen the First Nations' ability to negotiate different forms of self-governments over their traditional lands. Petrie suggests that similarities exist between these two areas, particularly in relation to the high levels of colonial settlement, which both areas have been subject to. Some of the processes that have been used in this case may be used to inform Aboriginal people in Victoria on how to develop systems and ways of negotiating treaties there. In New Zealand, what lessons can be learnt from what happened there? The Treaty of Waitangi was signed from the 1840 by Maori chiefs and representatives of the British and the Crown, but it failed to reach or achieve many of the agreements that were part of the treaty, with the ongoing detriment of Maori people. One fundamental issue that occurred was a result of a treaty being written in both English and Maori, resulting in different interpretations of the meanings. There was a significant divergence in how these two parts were interpreted, as Petrie explains. As a result, Maori people never believed absolute sovereignty was ceded, rather the treaty should have provided parallel paths of power under a single nation state, quote. Consequently, in 1975, the current government established the Waitangi Tribunal that provides an opportunity for Maori people to make claims based on the Crown breaches of Treaty of Waitangi. This was based on the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975. Its VTAC outlines current treaty settlements include Maori rights, explicit knowledge and apologies for breaches of the treaty and its principles, cultural and environmental redress and involvement in decision making. This example shows that even after the initial treaty failed, as a result of the state or government not abiding by many of the key conditions of agreement in the treaty, it can be resolved through subsequent acts of government which aims in good faith to resolve many of these failures. Finally, what has occurred within the United States. While Native American tribes in the United States established treaties with their British coloniser from 1778 to 1871, and they were enforceable legal documents, they were still largely ignored. However, a form of sovereignty was recognised by the United States government and has meant some form of self-governance does exist within tribal lands, including tribal courts. Currently, according to a Petrie summary on treaties, there are 567 tribal governments recognised by the federal US government, and these have specific legislative, judicial and regulatory rights and powers, as outlined in the website Indian Affairs Bureau. These publish the list of governments on the Federal Register. Again, even though the initial outcomes from the treaties that were signed didn't adequately deliver the outcomes that Indigenous people were entitled to, some basic rights were maintained, including some ability to manage their affairs within the context of the tribal lands, and acknowledgement of their sovereignty continued to exist to some extent. There is little evidence available from these examples to support fears that some people purport that it will divide the state of Victoria or Australia. Instead, they support the argument that treaties can provide legal protection for Indigenous people based on what is contained within the treaties and agreements. So where are we now in Australia, and what are the other states doing? While Victoria is taking the first official steps backed up by government policies and an act towards reaching a treaty with its Aboriginal people, there are other states also taking action. Currently, the Northern Territory and Queensland have indicated they're beginning to work on a process of reaching a treaty in those states. South Australia had also made a commitment to a treaty there, but this was revoked after a change of government in that state. This is something that has happened before at a federal government level many times, and is an ongoing obstacle in the path of achieving treaties within Australia. South Australia had entered into some treaty negotiations with a number of Indigenous Australian groups and appointed a treaty commission in 2017 before the process was subsequently stopped. This left Northern Territory, who has since recently been joined by Queensland. In 2016, the incoming minister in the NT established a subcommittee and announced an intention to advance treaty discussions and develop a treaty process there. One of the primary goals of a treaty was to deliver more local decision-making capabilities within communities. There was also a Northern Territory Treaty Commission established, headed by Professor Mick Dawson AM. His role is to consult extensively with Aboriginal people across the territory and inform the development of a framework for treaty negotiations. This followed an historical meeting and subsequent signing of the Barunga Agreement in 2018 between the Aboriginal Lands Council, composing of 4 groups, and the Northern Territory Government. Finally, Queensland has indicated it would join Victoria and Northern Territory in beginning their process towards a treaty in that state, recently releasing a report called Path to Treaty in Queensland Consultation Paper, Let's Start the Conversation, in September this year. It sets out an intention to begin a healing process through recognition of past wrongs and ongoing acts of successive governments since colonisation, which has left an, quote, enduring legacy of economic and social disadvantage, unquote, for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people there. It is becoming clear that even though the federal government remains reluctant to work towards a treaty that covers all First Nation people here, many states are taking initiative and are currently working towards resolving this issue at state government levels. While this has some clear limitations as to the scope of what can be achieved, it's not just tokenistic action, but one that can have very real benefits for First Nation people living in their states. It may also provide the impetus for other states to join in this process, as has occurred, with the potential for pressure to build up at a federal government level and force politicians at that level to acknowledge that this is something many Indigenous and non-Indigenous people support and expect them to act on. In 2018, the Advancing the Treaty Process with Aboriginal Victorians Act 2018 passed through Parliament. What this means is that there's now a legal requirement that an Aboriginal representative body be formed, and the state continues to support and work towards future treaty negotiations. This initial process involved contributions from approximately 7,000 Aboriginal Victorians over a couple of years. The intention of this process in reaching a treaty is to improve the lives of Aboriginal people currently living in Victoria, as well as the lives of future generations. However, before an actual treaty can be achieved, there are a number of important steps preceding it to ensure that it comes to fruition in a fair and constructive way. These are outlined by VTAC and ANT-AR Victoria on their website, these includes extensive community consultations and careful planning to ensure equal representation of all the diverse groups of Victorian Aboriginals. And also the process is financially supported to enable all the required steps to occur. So what has been the progress towards treaty in Victoria, and when did it begin? It began back in December 2015 when the Victorian State Government announced their intention to hold a self-determination forum, which commenced in February the next year. An Aboriginal Treaty Working Group was then created as a result of these discussions in July 2016. This was followed by extensive community consultations into 2017. Reporting back to community occurred in April. In November that year, there was a community assembly and final statements and recommendations were made back to the Aboriginal Treaty Working Group in December 2017. Following this, a Victorian Treaty Advancement Committee was established, VTAC, in January 2018. It is currently headed by Jill Goodacre, the Treaty Advancement Commissioner. They received a final report on the design of the Aboriginal Representative Body in March 2018. And in the same month, the first treaty bill was introduced into the Victorian Parliament. This resulted in the Act being assented into Parliament in June 2018, with the passing of the treaty bill and subsequent the advancing the treaty process with Aboriginal Victorians Act 2018 being formed. This Act is significant as it represents the first law relating to a treaty being passed in Australia. Later in 2018, there was a statewide gathering and Elders Forum held by the Commission in Melbourne. There was also extensive consultations continuing statewide in the form of local meetings where about 1,000 people in total attended. Information from this was collated, helping to inform how the representative body would look like and subsequently fed back to VTAC. Financial support was provided, ensuring sufficient capability to continue the next phase of the treaty by the Victorian State Government in the last budget. This ensures the process is adequately funded for the next 2 years as the next very important phase continues. In the most recent phase, community events have continued to begin the process of appointing the representative body, including nominations for the People's Assembly and informing people what it means to them. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can vote for a traditional owner or help inform the treaty process into the future. There are extensive guidelines on who needs to be included in the representative body, ensuring a fair representation with a minimum number of female candidates required and an even distribution of people covering all the diverse Aboriginal groups within Victoria. In September this year, voting for the People's Assembly opened and it closed on October the 20th, which is this week. This signifies a shift away from disempowerment of Aboriginal communities for over 240 years. And according to Ms Gallagher, an online ABC News article, she remains hopeful that these historic elections will instead now empower them. As a result of these votes, there will be 32 people elected to work out the rules and conditions, assisting the Victorian Government to then negotiate separate treaties within Victorian clans and nations. The final part of this phase occurs in December this year when the first meeting of the Assembly is scheduled to occur. According to firstpeoplesvic.org website, the Australian Assembly will work alongside the Victorian Government, setting up a treaty authority, the Treaty Negotiating Framework, and a self-determination fund to provide financial support, ensuring they're not at a financial disadvantage. While there are several states now beginning the process of working towards a treaty with First Nation people, and Victoria is making the most significant progress to date, there remains dissenting voices and doubts expressed by the people involved in the process or who others are aware of what is happening. One obstacle which has occurred many times previously is the challenge of a lack of federal involvement and what this might mean. The primary issues expressed by Hobbes from a legal perspective is that treaties being political agreements are also very vulnerable to political fluctuations. As mentioned earlier, this recently occurred during South Australia's progress towards a treaty, when a change of government stopped any further steps occurring at that stage. Within Victoria, there are also concerns being raised by some Aboriginal people there, including one group represented by the Yorta Yorta Elders Council, who expressed their fears that it could be another pathway to assimilation. They also stated that Victorian government still functions under a representative of the Crown of England and maintains the role of the Crown within Australia, ignoring the history of Yorta Yorta people who belonged to the country long before states and governments existed there. And this is a core part of their objection. Finally, there have been opposition coming from the Djab Embassy. These are a group of traditional owners who feel the government, despite expressing good intentions within the current treaty process, are continuing to ignore their views. They launched a No Trees, No Treaty campaign in Victoria to highlight this concern. This involved significant trees, what they termed birthing trees, that were under the possibility of being removed for new roads. Recently, it was reported the compromise was made the Victorian government in an attempt to settle the matter, but it highlights the need for the state government to be consistent in their approach in all matters concerning Aboriginal Victorians, not just in certain situations or under the current treaty pathways, while concurrently or ignoring other issues that are relevant and still need to be addressed more appropriately and taking their history and culture into account. So in conclusion, there have been many ongoing calls for an Indigenous voice to be recognised and strengthened in Australia, and reaching a treaty with First Nations people is seen by many as a way of achieving this. While Australia at federal government level is currently avoiding this option, many of the states, including Victoria, have started to make steps towards achieving a treaty with Aboriginal people living in their state. Currently, Victoria has achieved the most progress, bringing into law a treaty bill in 2018, which enforces an ongoing commitment by the state government to work towards a treaty there. Voting for the Representative Council, which will begin to work towards what a treaty will involve, has recently closed, with the first meeting of Assembly planned for December. Despite some small pockets of opposition within Victoria, most Aboriginal people remain supportive of the process, and this will become more apparent once the Council works towards an actual treaty, especially if they are fairly represented within this body. Based on international examples such as New Zealand and Canada, there will be challenges, but there will also be great opportunities to regain control of our lands and their lives that was lost post-invasion in 1788. Aboriginal people in Australia have already proven their ability to self-govern and control many services, especially not-for-profit and other business enterprises, if they are given the opportunity and appropriate support to deliver these. Many previous failures were a result of a lack of adaptations of the service delivery models based on Western ways, with often unreasonable reporting expectations, creating extreme pressures within these services. By encouraging this dialogue as part of the process of reaching treaties in Australia, including Victoria, enables both parties to set realistic expectations of what will be involved or included in the treaties. The outcomes of these treaties can then be successfully achieved by maintaining a thorough and open process that is ultimately driven by First Nation peoples themselves, who are a political entity in their own right and an equal partner in the treaty process. This will then enable improvements for all parties, particularly Aboriginal people, unlike many of the agreements that have preceded them. If it is entered into on an equal footing, it will enable empowerment and further opportunities.